We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 27th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, with barely enough time to draw breath, many leaders moved on from the NATO summit in The Hague to the EU summit, which was held in Brussels yesterday. We'll examine the outcome. Then,
Serbia's students are on the march again. I'm Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy Delaunay, and I'll have more on tomorrow's mega protest in Belgrade, as well as presidential predictions of violence.
reactions to the NATO summit continue. We'll get the perspective from New Zealand. We'll have a rustle through the day's papers with our security correspondent, and then...
And in these controversial times where democracy is under pressure, I want to show that I want to do this.
We hear about community voting in Switzerland, plus plenty of fodder for Andrew Muller's wry look back at the week, and a spate of new openings give theatre critic Matt Wolfe much to tell us about too. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has spoken for the first time since the Iran-Israel ceasefire, threatening retaliation against US bases if Iran is targeted again. India has blocked a UN aviation expert from joining the investigation into the Air India crash amid mounting scrutiny over black box delays. And Anna Wintour is stepping down from her long-held Vogue editor-in-chief post, but remains Condé Nast Global Editorial Director and Chief Content Officer. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, leaders of the 27 EU nations met in Brussels for a closed one-day summit yesterday. Coming immediately after the NATO gathering, the meeting had a heavy geopolitical focus, tackling issues such as defence, autonomy and engagement. Well, to unpack this from just outside Cannes, I'm joined by Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and the former CNN Europe editor. Nina, sorry to break into your Riviera reverie, but many thanks for joining us. What were the main splits between leaders at this meeting?
Hi there, Georgina. Well, obviously, as you pointed out, this summit came hot on the heels of the NATO summit, and almost all of the EU member states, with the exception of about 4 or so, are members of both of these organisations. So as you can expect, defence was high up on the agenda, and especially how to meet that 5% commitment that was agreed to at this NATO summit just before, placating the other elephant in the room, which was, of course, Donald Trump, present at that NATO summit, but not present, obviously, at an internal EU summit. And it's the threat of 50% trade tariffs looming in just a few days' time that really focused minds here among EU leaders. He's threatened to impose that hefty tariff on all goods coming from the EU to the United States, one of the biggest trading partners for this entire bloc. There has been a hiatus that the US granted the EU, but that expires on July the 9th. And so the urgency in the room was very much felt in terms of how to try and come up with a way to placate America and to, prevent these tariffs from being imposed. There's already a 10% levy on steel and aluminium goods. What I can say is that it seems as though there was a bit of a bifurcation between the two biggest economies inside the EU, France and Germany, about how tough exactly to go with Donald Trump, or to, just as Germany's leader wants, to see a quick and dirty trade deal. There were other issues on the agenda, like, for instance, Israel. and how to apply pressure upon Netanyahu's government there, and also how to create a new EU alternative to the WTO so that they can maintain the international rules-based trading order. And tariffs on, so I beg your pardon, sanctions on Russia continues to be something that they have in the top of the agenda because they have to renew them pretty soon.
Now, Slovakia turns out to be a big sticking point on that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, has repeatedly said that he's concerned about Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU Commission's efforts to try and get countries like Slovakia to wean themselves urgently off of Russian oil and gas. This applies also to a situation that Hungary is facing. He's very, very irked that he believes that the Russian energy giant Gazprom could sue Slovakia if they unilaterally break their gas contracts with Russia. And as such, he's saying, well, unless you try and help me assuage the Russians on that side, I'm not willing to sign up on a new package of EU sanctions applied upon Russia. Now, one of the particularities of how the EU and other international bodies implement sanctions on Russia is that they have to renew them every 3 months. And so the latest round of sanctions renewal, legal technicalities has to be gone through in July. And as such, Slovakia is not playing ball and saying they may well wish, and will indeed, wish to continue their veto over sanctions on Russia because of this issue over their dependence of Russian gas. But we have to remember that the government of Robert Fico over there, a populist in Slovakia, has long been very close to the Kremlin and often taken Russia's side on some arguments. It's feared inside the EU.
Why is Macron pushing to delay climate goals?
Yes, he appears to have done a complete volte-face on the issue of climate. It's not entirely clear. This could be for his domestic agenda. It could also be because, France wants to focus on things like selling lots of fighter jets and focus on other trading issues. But the reality is that obviously with a presidential election coming up in 2027, even though he himself can't run for another term, the fear is that everybody across the EU is souring on climate goals when their economies themselves are souring. That is giving an in to the far right in places like France and elsewhere, who are dead against all of these, wind turbines on their front doorsteps across, agricultural lands. That's something that is felt in Germany and giving the AfD a bit of a footprint in the German countryside. And so he has now taken aim at the EU's climate change goals, and that is an embarrassment for Ursula von der Leyen, because remember, the climate agenda was the signature policy of her first term at the helm of the EU Commission, and she resoundingly dumped that essentially to try and make sure she could get a second term, instead pivoting to the issue of the day, which is defence.
Now, as we know, the NATO and EU summits happened back to back. I wonder how you think they compare in tone and outcome, and are Europe's leaders singing from the same hymn sheet, or are they still squabbling over the lyrics?
Well, obviously, the threat of Russian aggression, if the war in Ukraine bleeds outside of Ukraine into the EU and NATO borders, which, by the way, are the same borders, in the East, that has obviously focused minds. And you could see, especially with the sort of oleaginous buttering up of the US president by Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, in the run-up to this NATO summit, former Dutch Prime Minister, no less, by the way. You could see that very much sort of got these countries that, as I said, almost all of the EU member states are members of NATO, with the exception of countries like Malta, Austria and Cyprus. It got them to, hone their message and agree on this rather ambitious 5% defence spending target, with the exception of one of them, which is Spain, that really is holding out. So you are seeing more or less almost all of the EU member states, especially in the setting of NATO, where you actually have their biggest trading partner, Donald Trump, threatening to impose these 50% tariffs on EU countries in the room physically. You have seen them come together and actually do things that they would never have thought possible earlier this week at a NATO summit. The question is, when it comes to the EU summits, they actually have to rubber stamp and find the money for this kind of spending and for these policies. And as you can see there are some that are holding out, like, for instance, Spain. Obviously, with the backdrop of, as I said, NATO being about defence, being about concrete threats, sometimes a lot more gets done, and they have far fewer NATO summits than you have EU summits. But I think the main thing for this EU summit, aside from defence, was really the big concern about the economy is getting junked by these 50% tariffs that could be coming from America on July the 9th when that hiatus is up. And so the focus really is how to very, very swiftly turn America towards their cause. And Germany appears to be very, very keen on getting a very quick trade deal, irrespective of, standing firm on certain key EU issues. France, it seems, is demurring quite a bit on that. And so that could be another one of those kind of splits at a very high EU level that, of course, you didn't see at the NATO level.
Nina, thank you very much indeed. That's international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor Nina dos Santos speaking to us from the French Riviera. This is The Globalist. It's 8:10 in Belgrade, 7:10 here in London. St Vitus Day is always a big holiday in Serbia, but tomorrow is going to be even more of an event than usual, with students planning a mega protest in the capital, Belgrade. It's the latest peak in the ongoing anti-corruption protests, which followed last November's disaster at Novi Sad railway station. 16 people died when a concrete canopy collapsed at the recently renovated facility, and the students and many other Serbians have been calling for accountability ever since. Well, now they're demanding elections, but President Alexander Vučić says that they're plotting violence, and he's made ominous warnings about how the police might react. Well, let's find out more from Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy Delaunay. Guy, many thanks for coming on the show. What is planned for the protest?
Well, we haven't got all of the details yet, but it seems fairly safe to assume that there's going to be a large gathering in one of the main squares in the city on Saturday evening. This is Slavia Square, which is, to be honest with you, a bit more of a roundabout than a square. It's not the most beautiful square in the city. But what's interesting about that venue, Georgina, is that not only was it the site of a very large protest in Belgrade in December, but 3 months ago in March, when we had the last mega protest, suddenly the crowd parted like the waves of the Red Sea. And if you've seen the video online, it's very bizarre footage. And we've been hearing ever since these claims that the authorities deployed some sort of a sonic weapon against the crowd at that time, who were in the middle of holding a silence in memory of the 16 people who died at Novi Sad railway station. So that's been very controversial. It's not really been settled. So holding the protest there on Saturday evening, again, seems to be referring back to that and almost daring the authorities, if they've got a sonic weapon, to whip it out again.
And so what do these protesters actually want?
Well, at the moment, they've gone to the most basic demand of them all, which is for fresh elections. Previously, they had a list of demands, which were mostly relating to the collapse of the concrete canopy at Novi Sad railway station last November, which was a really shocking event. So this was Serbia's signature infrastructure project, the Belgrade to Budapest high-speed railway line, Novi Sad railway station, the second city of Serbia, obviously a key stop on that line. And to have the canopy collapse and kill 16 people standing underneath, just going about their day, was absolutely shocking, because the President, Alexander Vučić, has really made it his signature that he's moving Serbia forward, and that one of his ways in which he's doing this is improving the infrastructure. Well, if that infrastructure is killing Serbian people, clearly that's a big problem. So people wanted accountability for that. They had these demands for people to be prosecuted, for there to be a full investigation. But in essence, not all of the demands were met to the satisfaction of the student-led anti-corruption protests. And they're now saying that the only thing which can solve the issue is to hold fresh elections.
And do you think there's a lot of enthusiasm still on the ground? I mean, we know that more than 300,000 people turned out for the last big protest in March. Will it get that level of support again?
And that's the really interesting thing. I'm looking forward to seeing how many people do turn out for this, because, when you cover Serbia for more than a dozen years, as I now have, you've seen a lot of protest movements come and go, most of them without achieving particularly much. And they all start off the same way, with a great deal of enthusiasm, reasonably high numbers, and absolutely convinced that this time it's going to be different. This time they're going to change things. And we've seen that with this student-led movement over the past 8 months, this absolutely cast-iron belief among the students at least that they are going to somehow force through some meaningful change in Serbia. Now, in March, we saw, as you say, more than 100,000 people turn out. I think that's a conservative estimate, but it's the closest to an independent estimate that we've got for the numbers that turned out in March. Huge numbers in a country of just 6.5 million people. But are those sort of numbers going to turn up again? Because what's key isn't the core of the student activism. It's the alliance with other Serbian people and this wide range of people across the political spectrum, all of whom shared these same concerns about impunity and accountability.
And what's President Vucic been saying?
Yeah, he's been saying that, again, we had this in the run-up to the protest in March, but he's again been accusing the student protesters of attempting to overthrow the constitutional order somehow. And as if to underline that, in the run-up to these protests, we've seen the police arrest more than half a dozen people and specifically charge them for calling for a violent change of the constitutional order. People have been pushing back against that, saying these were people just having conversations either on messaging apps or in coffee shops and talking about how they'd like to change things. Mr. Vucic insists that, in fact, they're bent on violence, and that if there is violence at these protests, then the police are ready to respond.
And are the protests likely to change anything?
Well, this is the thing. It's all about enthusiasm. And Mr. Vucic has said he's willing to hold fresh elections, but not until December next year. And that's obviously not in a time frame that the students are particularly keen on. The students really can't do anything to force this to happen. They've called on people to stage acts of civil disobedience if their demands for fresh elections aren't met by 9 o'clock tomorrow. That's what they want, 9 o'clock in the evening tomorrow. They want the government to have submitted a formal request to the president to dissolve the National Assembly. And if they don't get that, they say there's going to be a campaign of civil disobedience to follow. But it's when you've already had the volume turned up pretty high in terms of protest and civil disobedience, there's a question of what more you can do.
Guy, thank you very much indeed. That's Guy Delaunay there, Monocle's Balkans correspondent. Now, still to come on the programme.
We learned that the 2025 North Atlantic Treaty Organization Summit appeared to have been brought to us by the word daddy.
Andrew Muller's What We Learned. This is The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS House View, you get the big picture in bite-sized articles, delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts, all focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. UBS, banking is our craft.
Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers, and I'm joined now from Zurich by Monocle's security correspondent, Gorana Grgic. Gorana, many thanks for coming on the programme. We were just talking about the EU summit, and I'd like to pick up a little bit on that, on something we didn't get into, and this is this possible vote of confidence against von der Leyen. Politico's got a good analysis of this.
Absolutely, and it's certainly not something that the Commission wants to advertise as it convenes the summit, but indeed, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is likely to survive a looming no-confidence vote triggered by a right-wing Romanian lawmaker over what has been a widely reported story about her handling of COVID-era vaccine contracts. So all of this stems from the so-called Pfizer-Gate scandal. We remember there were all these undisclosed text exchanges between von der Leyen and the Pfizer CEO during the pandemic negotiations. And now the sort of far or hard right cluster of MEPs, about 70 of them, which is what you need to actually start a motion on the floor of the European Parliament, have basically gotten to this point to try to have a vote on this. But what Politico reports and what is very likely that is going to happen is that they will fail at reaching a 2/3 majority, which is what you would need in a 720 strong parliament to actually pass this no confidence motion.
But nevertheless, still quite damaging for von der Leyen to have to deal with this in the first place.
Absolutely. There is no doubt that this is something that is politically bruising because, of course, the president of the commission will have to publicly defend herself. And this is something where, of course, we know that the commission is governed by the sort of compromise between different sort of political alliances within the European Parliament. So this will no doubt pose further strain and pose some questions over transparency, and it is expected to continue as we get into the next month, this whole debate.
Let's go to Tuvalu and Australia now. So Australia has this unique, I think, visa system, which is climate linked. Tell us more about that.
This is a landmark truly in climate diplomacy. So about 3,000 Tuvaluans, about a third actually of this Pacific island nation's population, have already applied for a new Australian visa that is designed specifically for climate affected citizens. So this is a story that Guardian is reporting, and it refers to a last year's deal when basically Australia committed to offering just under 300 visas a year to Tuvalu adults because it recognizes the existential threat that is posed by the rising sea levels. So we are seeing now a lot more interest actually than Australia initially expected actually, but the whole story is not without its controversy because it's saying that it's basically leading to what a lot of experts are warning, a drain of the country's skilled professionals and maybe speeding up the kind of long-term viability of Tuvalu.
To Florence now, and a photograph gone wrong in the Uffizi Gallery. Tell us more.
So this is in New York Times, but also in plenty of other newspapers and sort of web portals over the past couple of days following what was a very awkward selfie attempt at Florence's famed Uffizi Gallery, which caused real damage this week. So I don't know if you saw this, Georgina, but there were also some videos of this as well when a tourist who was trying to snap a photo in front of an 18th century portrait of the Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici stumbled over a safety barrier and actually punched a hole in the canvas. So of course, you can imagine that the museum director wasn't amused. He didn't mince words. He's blaming the trend of these visitors coming to museums, treating them truly as backdrops for selfies and not truly as places, as institutions to appreciate centuries-old art. And this is not an isolated incident. We've seen similar things happen in some other museums just a couple of months ago, also in Verona. So now this has reignited truly concerns across European museums about how to protect cultural heritage in the era of smartphones and selfies.
And of course, we saw the staff at the Louvre go on strike because of this, because of overcrowding and because of selfies and so on.
Yeah, I think this is a broader sort of story that we are seeing, that's connected to the kind of discussions we are seeing about over-tourism, about citizens as well, sort of protesting about what it does to local communities. So I think it's a broader sort of story about, how tourism maybe differs from travel, and can you be a good traveler rather than just act as a tourist? I think it's something, for sure, it's a Monocle topic that I'm sure is bound to get covered more and more in the months ahead, of course, as we head deep into European summer.
Absolutely. Finally, let's talk about Anna Wintour. So she has announced that she's stepping down, but she'll stay in overall control at Condé Nast and Vogue US. Tell us more.
Yes, so this was the sort of the alert to media that was sort of news, but also when you read it, quite intently and in details, it's not quite that Anna Wintour is stepping down from Vogue entirely. I mean, there is a bit of a change of guard because she will basically be stepping back from day-to-day control, but in essence, she still remains very influential as Condé Nast's chief content officer and global editorial director for Vogue, which is sort of she's the supreme leader, I guess, of all Vogue all over the world. And she, of course, oversees dozens of titles that are under the sort of Condé Nast umbrella. But what I found really amusing now in this sort of new era or newish era, even though, again, Wintour will be there as sort of editor emerita, are the various memes that are swirling around social media about who would replace her. And one that I really found quite amusing is Stanley Tucci, of course, who was in that movie Devil Wears Prada that might or might have not been inspired by Anna Wintour's ruling over Vogue US.
And as you say, when you go into this, you can actually see that this is perhaps not her just stepping back, but in fact stepping up even more, because over the last 4 years, her role at Condé Nast has vastly expanded, and her remit, Vogue says, across the company's global titles has grown alongside her work editing Vogue US, and of course all the events that she does, Vogue World, the Met Gala, and so on. And actually having somebody to run the magazine day to day is just going to free her up to take on all those additional responsibilities. Do we have any idea who might be in the frame for the top job?
I really, and I would agree wholeheartedly. I would just say that the only kind of notable absence or sort of exception to this is the New Yorker, where David Remnick has been able to sort of hold reins over what goes on over there. But you're absolutely right. I think also we could read it as Anna Wintour basically now getting maybe more sort of opportunities to kind of control other things, given that she would be freed up from the admin of the sort of daily goings on in the Vogue. I actually haven't heard much about the sort of gossip around who it might be. It will be, I would say, an unenviable role, because these are truly big shoes to fill. And again, shoes to fill while the person who was your predecessor is still there and could be looming large. So whoever takes it on will be indeed a very brave person.
Absolutely. Gorana, many thanks. That's Gorana Good speaking to us from Zurich. She is, of course, our security correspondent. You're with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, made his first public appearance since the Israel-Iran ceasefire and warned that any future US attack would be met with strikes on American bases in the region. He also dismissed recent US airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites as ineffective and vowed not to surrender to Western pressure. Indian authorities declined the International Civil Aviation Organization's offer to send a UN aviation investigator to observe the probe into the June the 12th Air India Dreamliner disaster, which claimed 260 lives. The move triggered criticism amid concerns over delays in analysing black box data and lack of transparency in the investigation. And Anna Wintour announced she's stepping away from her role as editor-in-chief of US Vogue after 37 years at the helm, marking the end of an era in fashion publishing. She confirmed she would retain her global responsibilities at Condé Nast as chief content officer and global editorial director, whilst the company searches for a new head of editorial content. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It is 18:28 in Wellington, 7:28 here in London. At this week's NATO summit in The Hague, New Zealand's Christopher Luxon stood alone among Indo-Pacific allies. Although not a member of NATO, New Zealand has been invited to attend as part of a tailored partnership programme with the alliance, meaning they cooperate on various security issues. Japan's Prime Minister Kishida cancelled his attendance, while South Korea and Australia had already decided to boycott the gathering. So I'm joined now by Geoffrey Miller, who's a geopolitical analyst with the Democracy Project in New Zealand. Geoffrey, thanks for coming on the show. I wonder if you could just start by explaining New Zealand's relationship with NATO and how that works.
Yes, good evening to you from New Zealand. Good morning to you in London. New Zealand has attended NATO summits now for 4 years running, and Christopher Luxon is the third successive New Zealand Prime Minister to do so. Jacinda Ardern went to the NATO summit in Madrid back in 2022, and it's very much been a development after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and New Zealand has taken a more security-focused, more hawkish view of the world, I think, since that time. So I think that's one of the big drivers here for Christopher Luxon to be going. It's that broader change in New Zealand's foreign policy. The other reason, though, is simply it's a good chance to meet a lot of world leaders in one place. And you have to remember, New Zealand is a small country of 5 million people at the bottom of the world. It doesn't get invited to a lot of these big summits. It's not part of the G7 or G20. It doesn't get invitations, even in the way that Australia does. Anthony Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, was a guest at the G7, for example, in Canada. So I think getting that face time is one of the reasons that Christopher Luxon has used to justify his participation. And he certainly got some good face time there with Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, Mark Carney, the new Canadian Prime Minister, and Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, the Ukrainian President. And these are leaders that he just wouldn't normally get to meet.
Why was New Zealand alone amongst Indo-Pacific countries in attending?
Well, in some ways, by virtue of circumstances, really. Christopher Luxon announced his trip a couple of weeks ago, and it was part of a two-part international trip. He went to China, first of all, and it was a very interesting sequencing here, going to China to meet Xi Jinping and then flying direct from Beijing to Europe to attend the NATO summit. And so it was an interesting juxtapositioning there. And he was kind of committed to going to NATO. The other leaders, notably the Japanese Prime Minister and the South Korean President, withdrew really over the weekend, and Christopher Luxon was already there. It would have been quite awkward for him to withdraw at that point. And so I think that's why he went through with it. But it was a quite different summit, I think, than he was expecting, because he didn't get he didn't have the chance to have his meeting with the other IP4 leaders, as they're called in NATO, and he didn't get certainly a meeting with Trump, and that was the hope, I think, that Donald Trump would have had a meeting with the at least three of the IP4 leaders. Anthony Albanese from Australia was never, I think, confirmed as going, but the other two certainly were. But in the end, it didn't happen, and Christopher Luxon ended up with more lower-level meetings when it came to the IP4.
Is New Zealand bound by the demand to increase defence spending, and what's Luxon said about that?
No, look, New Zealand is a NATO partner, very much not a NATO member, and Christopher Luxon has emphasised that himself. He's been saying, look, NATO is really about Europe. It's quite interesting. He's almost been dialing back a bit New Zealand's links with NATO. And I think that is in part because of the pressure going on to increase defence spending up to that 5% level, which is an enormous sum. New Zealand has made some big steps in recent months towards increasing its defence spending, and it announced a new defence capability plan back in April that will see it spending another $5 billion US dollars in defence over the next 4 years. So New Zealand will get up to that 2% level that has traditionally been NATO's target by the early 2030s. And that's a big step for New Zealand, because at the moment the defence spending has been around half of that level. So that's already a big shift for New Zealand. And I think Christopher Luxon will say, well, look, we're already doing our bit, and we can't really afford to spend a lot more at the moment. Let's get up to 2% first, and then let's see. And the other thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, that juxtapositioning of Christopher Luxon's trip, and China certainly is very much the target here of of NATO. That's why Christopher Luxon really is being invited from NATO's perspective. NATO sees China now as part of its remit, and it wants to contain China. So New Zealand and the IP4 members are really being brought into NATO to support NATO's program is against China. And that is a risky business for New Zealand, because China is New Zealand's biggest trading partner by some margin. Around a third of New Zealand exports go to China every year. All the meat, all the dairy products that New Zealand exports, a large proportion of those do go to China now. And as we've seen in the past few months, the United States has been introducing new tariffs, and we're not really seeing open markets when it comes to New Zealand's Western partners, even though they like to talk about solidarity when it comes to the security situation. And New Zealand also has a free trade agreement with the EU, but there are real limitations on that, and still tariffs in place, even though it's a free trade agreement, quote unquote. But New Zealand is facing still 7.5% tariffs, with a relatively small quota of 10,000 tonnes of beef that it's allowed to export into the European Union, for example.
Jeffrey, thank you very much indeed. That's Jeffrey Miller, geopolitical analyst with the Democracy Project in Wellington. This is Monocle Radio. Switzerland is famous for many things, one of which is its form of direct democracy. Citizens can vote on all kinds of issues, from building new parks to corporate taxes, immigration and social benefits. This happens at the national level through referendums, but also at the very local level. Some of these votes are even public open-air affairs, where participants raise voting cards in the air to make their voices heard. We sent our contributing editor, Jessica Bridger, to one of these community votes to find out more.
It is a warm June evening in Ennetbaden, Switzerland. The village of about 3,700 is located just 15 minutes from Zurich by train, and right across the Limmat River from the historical industrial powerhouse city of Baden, also famous for its mineral springs. Ennetbaden is idyllic and green, with large houses, vineyards, and a picturesque village centre known as Postplatz. This past evening, most of the Postplatz was roped off and filled with orderly rows of wooden chairs. This was for the Gemeindeversammlung, community meeting, where the village gathered to participate in Swiss direct democracy. The Gemeinderat, local council, takes responsibility for running the event, which is both informational and an exercise in active civic decision-making. The vice president of the Gemeinderat, Tanja Kessler, took a moment to explain more to Monocle at the Apero immediately following the meeting.
It was the Gemeindeversammlung. It's all the people that can elect, they have the Swiss passport, they can come here, and together we decide what we are doing the next few years. We decide which streets we will build new, we decide what we are doing with the school, we decide about different things for the next years.
The open-air vote means that you greet friends and neighbors as you file in and out of the voting area. You learn more about your community, and you participate in its future. The assembly outside also means that you know exactly how everyone votes, and who has come this evening to even have a say. For Kessler, who is very visible in the community and a well-liked member of the Gemeinderat, it also provides a certain perspective.
To see the confidence of the people, to see that they are confident with our work, that they ask questions which are important, so that we see, we can something improve. But finally that we get the results from them and the direct feedback that we are making our job good.
Two huge screens at the Gemeindeversammlung were used to present statistics, the current budget, results from various initiatives and comprehensive overviews of the proposals that the Swiss citizen residents could decide on. As the proposals were presented by the local council members, the community had a chance to not only vote, but to first ask questions and even challenge assumptions. Access for those with impairments was raised in response to 2 projects, calling attention at the level of the individual citizenry and also the council, who pledged to improve it in both. This is local-level politics in action. For Timon, a German who has naturalized in Switzerland, it also has an existential aspect. It reflects his rights as a citizen, father, and local taxpayer.
I think I would like to take my right to vote. And so this is my democratic right to have impact on the Gemeindespolicy. Yeah, I pay taxes and I want to, of course, have some kind of a voice how that my taxes is spent. Typically you have to vote on the budget and on some projects. When you have now there is a vote on the Dachtäli, which is some kind of a public park which they want to renew. We are a family, we have kids, so it's obvious that we vote for it.
Ennet-Baden is home to a national-level politician, also eager to participate in her local community's political life.
My name is Simona Brizzi. I'm a politician and I'm in the national parliament and I'm living in Ennet-Baden.
Local voting, through meetings like the Gemeindeversammlung, is at the root of the entire Swiss political system at all levels. The individual has a shared responsibility that goes from the local and the regional up to the national and finally international levels.
I mean, we have a direct democracy, so everybody who has the Swiss passport can give his votes, and we vote a lot. And it's a privilege that we can always decide what's important and which way we want to go together. And I think it's a very important part for our future. And it's get strength because we can decide it together. And it's makes you feel also part of it because you decide.
For the Swiss-American Urs, there is the recognition that the right to participate in open, transparent political processes is a privilege and a responsibility.
I try to go whenever I can and whenever there are subjects that I'm interested in. And tonight I could go. I was not that interested in the subjects because they were not very controversial. But yes, I go when I can. It's a privilege, a form of direct democracy. And I told my wife when she said, why are you going? I said, look, it's a privilege to have this right to participate directly. And in these controversial times where democracy is under pressure, I want to show that I want to do this. Because if nobody goes, it will be lost.
While Switzerland is often held up as a place where things function ideally, from trains and public order to forestry and direct democracy, it should be seen as an example and not only as an excellent exception. Local-level politics and political processes are the first line of defense in democracies, the world over, not only in Switzerland. Public and visible participation is ever more important now, as we are rediscovering the power of the people, from the local up to the global. For Monocle in Ennet-Baden, Switzerland, I'm Jessica Bridger.
Thank you, Jessica. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
There's a craft to every question, which is why at UBS, we query every aspect of the market, working with specialized experts and award-winning research teams, covering over 3,500 stocks in 50 countries, all delivered in a comprehensive library, answering what you want with what you need. UBS, banking is our craft.
Now Now, as it's Friday, we turn to Andrew Muller for a look at the last 7 days.
We learned this week that at some previous juncture, Mark Rutte, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, now Secretary-General of NATO, may have struck some sort of bargain with a scarlet gentleman with horns and a tail, under the terms of which, yes, he gets to be the diplomatic and administrative head of the mightiest military force ever fielded, which is doubtless tremendous fun, but is obliged to forfeit his soul. Music there from Charles Gounod's opera Faust, adapted from Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's play of the same name, intended to evoke the notion of the proverbial Faustian pact, an extremely erudite device which we would not have wanted you to miss.
I get it now.
Righto, carry on.
And that's the NATO hymn. Yes, NATO has a hymn composed by Lieutenant Colonel André Reichling, a former band leader with the armed forces of Luxembourg, making by far the greatest contribution to Europe's collective defence that Luxembourg is ever likely to bestow. Ooh! Come on, what are they going to do about it? Monocle could take Luxembourg, and you've seen us.
Come on. Just get on with it.
We learned anyway that under the terms of Rutte's contract with Mephistopheles, whereas previous occupants of the Secretary-General's role got to engage with such US presidents as...
We must continue to create and sustain within the free world the necessary strength to make certain of the common security.
And...
While other alliances have been formed to win wars, our fundamental purpose is to prevent war, while preserving and extending the frontiers of freedom.
And
in this challenging moment, I want to take this opportunity to state clearly what will never change, and that is the unwavering commitment of the United States to the security and defense of Europe.
Rutte is damned to play abbot to the Costello of...
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
A role which, we learned, involves trying to keep the big goose happy by nodding gamely along to his somewhat Janet and John analyses of Middle Eastern affairs.
They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while you have to use a certain word.
We learned, however, that one certain word used by the Secretary-General had caught the ear of attending media, who were delighted to be furnished with an excuse to avoid reporting and explaining actual policy. To be clear, we, as a humorous weekly news review, are absolutely allowed to focus on such trivia and indeed inanity. We would be grateful at this time for the moral support of the General Muttered Agreement crew. Appreciate it.
Wait till your father gets, until your father gets, wait till your father gets home.
For we learned that the 2025 North Atlantic Treaty Organization Summit appeared to have been brought to us by the word daddy.
Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, who is your friend, he called you daddy earlier. Do you regard your NATO allies as kind of children?
No, he likes me. I think he likes me. If he doesn't, I'll let you know. I'll come back and I'll hit him hard, okay? No? He did it very affectionate. Daddy, you're my daddy.
Unless it wasn't.
The daddy thing, I didn't call him daddy. What I said is that sometimes in Europe, I hear sometimes countries saying, hey Mark, will the US stay with us? And I said, that sounds a little bit like a small child asking his daddy, hey, are you still staying with the family? So in that sense, I use daddy, not that I was calling President Trump daddy.
At the same confabulation of a free world, which may on reflection be less deserving of protection than we may previously have believed, We learned that international affairs are complicated.
No,
I'll be
really?
damned.
Oh,
Whoa.
that blows my mind.
Really?
No way. Blow me down.
We learned that among the people very nearly as surprised by this as you are is the President of the United States, as revealed when asked why ending Russia's rampage in Ukraine appeared to be taking somewhat longer than the 24 hours he had promised while campaigning.
You've now been in office for 5 months and 5 days. Why have you not been able to end the Ukraine war?
Because it's more difficult than people would have any idea.
This, despite the fact that we had previously learned from the same sagely source that, in contradiction to several dozen centuries of accrued conventional wisdom, the Middle East is really pretty straightforward, uncomplicated.
We basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the fuck they're doing.
And certainly nothing that cannot be addressed by communicating from an actual presidential social media account, and to be clear, this is a thing that happened, a 1980 vintage novelty hit by Vince Vance and the Valiants.
Bam, 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 Iran. Bam, 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 Iran.
We learned, however, that there are yet more severe audio punishments. For we learned that a new world record had been set for continuous playing of the steel pan. We learned that there was another 31 hours of that from whence that came, and we're now going to play all of it. No, but seriously, nobody is that cruel except, we learned, Trinidad and Tobago steel panist Joshua Regrello, who belaboured his pot lids for fully 1,860 minutes in pursuit of his place in the Guinness Book, despite this seeming very much like one of those records which is there for the taking for pretty much anyone who can be bothered, there being no apparent statutory requirement for any actual competence in the instrument, let alone expertise as rarefied as that indubitably possessed by Mr. Regrello. We learned when we did our research, because we're good like that there is a whole universe of such point-free endeavours, including records for continuous playing of banjo, 24 hours 57 seconds, tuba, 24 hours 8 minutes, and accordion, 80 brutal hours 53 unsparing minutes 28 merciless seconds. We have not learned, however, that a mark has been established for longest continual satirising of the previous 7 days' news events illustrated with whimsical audio effects. So we've something to aim at next week. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Miller.
Thank you, Andrew. You're with The Globalist. And finally, it's time to talk theatre with Matt Wolfe, theatre critic at the International New York Times, who joins me here in the studio. Matt, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Georgina.
You hated Hercules, and if anybody's in any doubt, they need to read your New York Times review because you've slated it.
Yeah, you know, the thing about it is it just should be better than this. I mean, Disney has all the resources in the world. It comes with a sizable fan base who are ready to lap it up. And also, it's gone through a sizable gestation. It began in Central Park. In 2019, it's been done in New Jersey. There's an ongoing German language production in Hamburg. So why isn't it better? And it just feels as if nobody involved is really giving it their A game. It's all kind of lazy. The choreography feels like a calisthenics class. The book, which is co-written by one of the guys who wrote the wonderful musical Shucked, recently seen here in Regent's Park, the jokes in that musical were glorious. Here they seem kind of borrowed and stale. And the performers are fine. The guy who plays Hercules is very sweet. He smiles a lot. He's got a kind of lovely white permagrin, which is very endearing, but it just doesn't add up to much. And the second act is barely 40 minutes, and you just get the feeling that they all want it to be over.
Just indulge me here. Is it a little bit pleasurable giving somebody a really bad review?
Well, people say that, but I suppose what happens with the bad review is it writes itself. They're easy to write. But actually, I have to say, I don't want to sound all Pollyanna-ish, but it is really lovely raving about something, as I will do later in this program.
Okay. Well, let's move on to The Bitter Earth.
Yes, this is a very provocative play by Harrison David Rivers, a Black American playwright that was first seen in San Francisco in 2017. It was done here 2 years ago in a different production, but this is a more high-profile production, principally of interest because the Tony-winning actor and gay American activist Billy Porter is the director of it. He was recently on the West End in Cabaret, which he's about to do again on Broadway, and here he is offstage directing a two-hander about a black man and a white man who meet, and they have a very fractious relationship across 4 years, divided between New York and St. Paul, Minnesota. The timing of the show is interesting because it's 2012 to 2015, so it's before even the first Trump presidency, but in a way, his sort of presence and so much of what's happened since 2015 hovers very portentously over the play. I think it's a little bit overstuffed and overwritten, but Billy Porter stages it with a lot of finesse, and the two performers, Amari Douglas and Alexander Lincoln, really do dig into it with great kind of verve. So I think if you know you've got a spare evening in Soho and the tickets aren't extortionate, it's worth giving it a go.
Yeah. Time now for that fabulous review, and that's for A Moon for the Misbegotten.
Oh, God, did I love this. I'm a big O'Neill fan anyway, Eugene O'Neill, the American playwright. And this is a play that was so painful for him, Georgina, that it wasn't premiered until after his death. It was just too close to the knuckle. The central male character, Jim Tyrone, is a sort of thinly veiled version of O'Neill himself. He's a kind of feckless Broadway boozer doing the rounds, racked by shame and guilt about his late mother, and he falls into the orbit of a very earthy female farmhand, Josie Hogan, who may or may not offer him one last chance of salvation. It's really a play about two people clutching at what last glimmer of life remains to them romantically and perhaps even literally. And the two central roles are acting catnip for performers. And here they're taken by Ruth Wilson as Josie Hogan, who's very, very good indeed, although she does need to speak up a bit, I will say. She does mumble a fair bit of the evening. But for me, the extraordinary success of it was Michael Shannon, the visiting American actor, who, funnily enough, has played this exact same part in a different O'Neill play, which was Long Day's Journey into Night on Broadway opposite Jessica Lange. So he knows the terrain, and boy, does he do drunk well, and boy, does he do the wounded psyche well. So worth watching.
Finally, this is a show that hasn't actually opened yet, but it's generating a huge amount of free publicity. Tell us about this revival of Evita.
Well, it feels like it's opened. I mean, it's been in the news constantly, and the reason is because Rachel Zegler, the 24-year-old American who's playing Eva Perón in this Jamie Lloyd production, does the anthemic number from the show, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, from the balcony of the theater, the Palladium, so overlooking Argyle Street. And if you happen to be, as a kind of passerby through that part of town, ambling through at 9 o'clock, I guess, or 4 o'clock at matinees or whatever, you can see her do it. And word about this has spread, so now it's become a bit of a thing. So people are planning their evening in order to be there, watching her as if she were at the Casa Rosada in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And what I'm very curious to see when I see the show in a few days is what it will be like to be on the inside of the theater when she's on the outside. How is that going to work?
Yeah, it sounds a little bizarre. I have actually been on that balcony of the Casa Rosada.
And did you sing Don't Cry for Me, Argentina?
Of course I did.
I bet you did it brilliantly. I hear they want you for the Wednesday matinees. I will say about this that Jamie Lloyd, the director, has formed with this kind of, if you want to call it a stunt or an approach, an aesthetic, whatever you want to call it, in the current Sunset Boulevard, which is just finishing on Broadway. The title number there is done out on the streets of New York, and he did a revival a couple years ago excellently on Broadway of a Doll's House or Jessica Chastain, where Nora in that production just exited onto the street.
Amazing.
So he likes to send you outdoors.
Absolutely. Matt Wolfe, thank you so much.
Thank
Matt's a theatre critic at the International New York Times. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Chris Chermak, Carlotta Rebello, Laura Kramer and Ryuma Takahashi, my researcher, Henry King, and our studio manager, Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at 1300 Paris time from our studios in Rue Bachemont, Studio 5. Monocle on Saturday tomorrow will be coming from Paris too, with my guests, philosopher A.C. Grayling, Michael Keating, the Executive Director at the European Institute of Peace, who's coming in from Brussels, and the foreign correspondent and author Peter Godwin. So that's all coming to you from Paris, and The Globalists will return from London at the same time on Monday. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.